Today's episode is a special live recording of To Save Us from Hell. This is our sister podcast about the United Nations, in which co-host Anjali Dayal and I discuss all things UN. Our conversation was recorded live on the Substack app. Welcome, everyone, to a special live edition of To Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist who's covered the United Nations for 20 years.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. I teach and I research and I write about the United Nations.
And Anjali, we are holding this special live edition of To Save Us from Hell because what unfolded at the United Nations this week is something that to me is completely unprecedented. Like, I speak for a living and I am having a hard time articulating, especially to like normies, the magnitude of what has unfolded at Turtle Bay over the last few days. It's wild.
It's a pretty, I think you put it in the title of the episode. It's a seismic shift that actually really very few things in international politics happen overnight, but this did happen overnight. It was presaged, obviously, by the election of Donald Trump, but still, to have a major world power switch sides in a war like this unilaterally, quickly, it's hard to find a historical precedent for that.
So why don't I run through like a TikTok rundown of events as they unfolded over these last few days to give listeners a sense of what we're talking about. So for many weeks now, there's been a General Assembly meeting scheduled to mark the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was scheduled for Monday, the 24th. Now, for the several weeks leading up to this General Assembly meeting, the European Union and Ukraine had been circulating a draft resolution marking the anniversary that said all of like the things you would expect it to say. It condemned Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It affirmed Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, all kind of normal stuff. And the process for the EU and for Ukraine was to gather as many co-sponsors and as much support for this resolution ahead of the vote so they can demonstrate profound international solidarity in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty. So all was going according to plan until this weekend, when surprisingly, out of nowhere, the United States introduced its own competing resolution on Ukraine that did not affirm Ukraine's sovereignty, that did not condemn Russia's aggression. In fact, this resolution is just like one paragraph, basically 3 sentences long. So I might as well read the whole thing for listeners. Mourning the tragic loss of life throughout the Russia Federation-Ukraine conflict. Note that formulation of how they define the conflict. Reiterating that the principal purpose of the United Nations, as expressed in the Charter of the United Nations, is to maintain international peace and security and to peacefully settle disputes. Implores a swift end to the conflict and further urges a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russia Federation. So this set up a showdown at the General Assembly between this terse and equivocating U.S. resolution and the more strong and robust Europe-led resolution. What unfolded Monday was a series of votes at the General Assembly around these competing resolutions. First up, Europe put forward their resolution, which is like the, strongly worded condemnatory one, and it passed. It passed at a vote of like 99 with 60-something abstentions, so not as overwhelmingly as a similar vote of its kind passed in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, which passed like 141 to like 5. And then there was a series of votes on the American resolution because some countries put amendments, sought to inject amendments into that terse and equivocating American resolution. One of the countries seeking to add amendments to this was Russia, which seeked to water it down even further. That vote was widely rejected. Then you had a couple of other amendments offered by Europe and Canada to make it a bit stronger. And so those amendments passed. And so the resulting American resolution was a bit more strongly worded than the United States had anticipated or wanted. So when the final text came to a vote, the US abstained from its own resolution.
That's right.
And then later in the day at the Security Council, a similar scene unfolded.
Yeah.
So basically, the US took that 3 sentence resolution that they offered at the General Assembly and just made it a Security Council resolution. And then the Security Council voted on that resolution, and it ended up passing with 10 votes in favor, 5 abstentions, and no vetoes. So the narrowest of margins possible. And so what we've seen at the UN, therefore, is this full-scale shift in American policy towards Russia against Ukraine. And it's not like it's subtle. It was done in recorded votes.
And, it's worth noting that after the invasion and then the first anniversary, these two resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and affirming to Ukraine's territorial integrity passed the General Assembly with active diplomatic work from the United States to get them passed. Like the US and its European allies were key engines in whipping support for Ukraine. Not that the Ukrainian cause wasn't just or wasn't widely embraced anyway. There's been in the years since some discomfort, particularly among countries in the global south, about how much Ukraine has skewed the work of the United Nations. That's the perception, right? At the expense of other conflicts. But at the end of the day, the fundamental cause, the idea that Ukraine's territorial integrity is worth defending, remains extremely popular. And we can see that from the first resolution after the invasion on through to this one today, which makes the US's position not just surprising because it flips sides, but because it is globally isolated. The list of countries that have voted with Russia in the past, very small, very predictable, extremely close allies of Russia or client states of Russia that are dependent on Russia. And then the sort of addition of the US to that list really demonstrates what the US is as a result. It is a client of Russia's in this conflict, as opposed to a steadfast guarantor of Ukraine's ability to continue waging the war. That's before we get to the fact that what the US is also doing here is fundamentally transforming itself from an underwriter of the United Nations system, which at its core, the UN is a pact that outlaws aggressive warfare and affirms the sovereign territorial integrity of every member state, the equality before the law, and the inviolability of its physical territories are cardinal principles of United Nations membership. And so, by signing on to a resolution, not just signing on to, drafting, putting forth a resolution that essentially says that there is no clear Ukrainian cause for belligerence, that the war should end without the sort of affirmation of Ukraine's sovereign territorial integrity, shows us that the US is not committed to the cardinal principles of the United Nations. And that means that the US is no longer the guarantor of this system, it is a risk generator for this system.
Mhm.
What it will do is try and pull down the principles that underpin this compact between states.
That is a really, really important articulation of the significance of this, because I feel like most commentators that I've seen and most commentary I've seen has viewed this vote kind of exclusively through the lens of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however you want to formulate it. And that's like an important lens with which to view this, right? Like, this was the US switching sides in that conflict. But the point you just made is why I think UN watchers like you and I, why our jaws hit the floor, because this move goes far beyond the Ukraine conflict. It strikes to the core fundamental principle of the United Nations, the key element of the UN Charter, that a more powerful country can't just invade and take the territory and try to topple the government of a neighbor. And that you have the United States, which, as you said, has been the guarantor of this liberal international order, that is the one that's undermining this. Like, you would expect Russia to undermine this, right? That's what they've been doing for so long. So this, to me, just calls into question, frankly, the viability of the United Nations going forward, at least in matters pertaining to peace and security. It'll do what it can do on humanitarian issues, but if the US can't abide by this fundamental principle of the UN Charter, then what else can be a pillar of our international system?
Well, I think there are a couple of things happening here. The first is that the reason the US has fundamentally been the key guarantor of the UN system from its inception onwards, right? 80 odd years afterwards, when you read the accounts of the UN's founding, the US is instrumental. It's the key state producing the particular arrangement that we see. The sort of sovereign equality of states has obviously old roots in international law, but the way it's reflected in the UN Charter comes from the Atlantic Charter, comes from that sort of World War II era compact between the Allied states. And then sort of married to like a global conception of the sort of New Deal for human flourishing. So those two components together reflect a particularly American internationalist conception of the world. The way the particular arrangement of the Security Council looks, the five permanent members and with a veto. The veto is the contribution of Joseph Stalin. The veto is the cost for entry for the Soviet Union. It is only if they get the veto that the Soviet Union will agree to sign on to the United Nations. And the key idea here, of course, is that you want the five great powers of the day to invest in this organization to keep it running if you want to guarantee an order that recognizes the sovereign equality of all states and binds them to a body of law. So at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not the Soviet Union and then Russia have adhered to the liberal principles of the order, they have adhered to the pact of sovereign states that sort of comes, sits down, meets, marks international peace and security. They continue to use the chamber to shape international peace and security as they will. But the US has traditionally been its sort of key opponent at the Security Council, right? The sort of veto counteracting the veto. And we've never seen an alignment of the Security Council in which the US will act alongside Russia. Now, I will say for a lot of other states,
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.